Daniel is currently distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute, but he was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs and NSC Senior Director for Speechwriting and Strategic Initiatives for the Biden administration. As Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs from 2021 to 2025, he took part in a range of initiatives, including diplomacy to end regional wars. I guess that didn't work out. Efforts to bring jailed Americans home safely, the evacuation of almost 100,000 Afghan allies through the Gulf after the end of the U.S. operations there, arms sales, semiconductor exports, commercial diplomacy, and competition with China in the Middle East. Dan has served in multiple stints at the White House, State Department, and the U.S. Senate, as well as think tanks and universities, including New York University, where I previously worked. He's been published in Foreign Affairs and the New York Times, and he's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dan, without further ado, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. Well, first of all, thanks, Mike. You all are very lucky to have Professor Williams, who's just an absolutely wonderful scholar and a wonderful guy. And so I'm happy to have the chance to be up here. Before the last couple of weeks, this talk, I decided to call it, the Gulf, Past, Present, and Future. I think now the present just got a whole lot more interesting. So I will sort of split my time between that bigger picture and then kind of double click in on what we're seeing here. And what I was going to talk about that turns out to be even more apt than I had thought originally is that in a lot of ways this is a region that's caught in between Vision 2030, which is the name of Saudi Arabia's kind of future-looking plan for modern development, and what some people call Vision 1979, which is the Iranian Revolution, this moment in time when there was, even in Saudi Arabia, a huge ferment and the storming of the Grand Mosque in Mecca that led to a period of kind of reactionary backlash. So they're sort of torn in between this future that they're trying to get to and this sort of current and recent realities in the region of 1979 and 2003, which was the last time that America went to large-scale war in this region before now. And so I think that kind of dilemma is only in some ways more acute today. And I think in the Q&A, I'm happy to get into a wider set of issues on the U.S. and Iran and kind of what this all means. I have, deliberated on these issues in the White House sit room and other places over the years, and I'm happy to kind of share macro-level thoughts. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, as you could hear from all the different kinds of things that you do, I had my foot in the different worlds, the 1979 world, the 2030 world, in all kinds of different ways. And I should say at the beginning of this that, just to qualify a little bit, the Gulf is actually, it really contains multitudes. They're the richest energy suppliers and the richest clean energy investors. They're the mediators for all kinds of peace and the instigators of a few challenges in a few places. They're a place that was responsible in the past for a lot of extremism, and I think today is probably the most promising and exciting place pushing back on the idea of religious extremism in favor of a different vision for the future, I think, that there is. There are also 7 different countries in the Arabian Peninsula, including Yemen and the 6 countries of the GCC. I'm mostly probably going to talk about Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, which I sometimes will call the UAE, and Qatar, but I think a lot of this will apply to the others as well. So let me start a little bit with the old model and where this all really began. And kind of give you a sort of layered picture of how this modern relationship was built. You start in 1945 on a ship, the USS Quincy, where Ibn Saud, the father of modern Saudi Arabia, met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president, and kind of hatched a strategic partnership and an energy partnership that really helped build a lot of the modern economic DNA of Saudi Arabia. We helped build the Saudi oil sector, which became kind of the template for the modern economy of Saudi Arabia, and really the template for building human capital in Saudi Arabia. So that was sort of the beginning of America's sort of large and deepest engagement with the Gulf. You layer over that a Cold War alliance. They too were against the godless communists who offended their religious and cultural and sensibilities and their commercial ambitions. So there was a Cold War alliance that we were really saw eye to eye on. And then, we started managing together through a period of insecurity. As I mentioned, the Carter Doctrine, after the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, you have the Carter Doctrine, which says that we're going to use force to protect American interests in the Persian Gulf. Layered over that, you have the liberation of Kuwait in 1991 after Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait, one of the Gulf states, which led to large-scale U.S. deployments in this region, which only accelerated as time went on through 9/11, which again was conducted by citizens of Gulf states, but also awoken the Gulf to the idea that their countries, their kingdoms were the most threatened by Al-Qaeda and terrorism of probably anybody. And they became kind of extremely close counterterrorism partners to the United States. So that was a defense partnership that just, I think, deepened and deepened. And in a region surrounded by upheaval over those years, the Gulf states really tried to be sort of calm, quiet, centered. And sometimes that meant in those years that they were quite sleepy. They were run often by very old men. And they were sort of looking in some ways to preserve a status quo rather than to sort of break something and try something new. I think, but then increasingly in the last 10 years, you've seen a sort of generational shift. First of all, a genuine generational shift in the leaders. People like Mohammed bin Salman, who's just entered his 40s, effectively running Saudi Arabia. And basically a group of leaders who are looking at the same problem set, who are younger and just look at it from a different time horizon. There's a famous old saying from the old Saudi oil minister about 30 years ago, who said that the Stone Age didn't end when we ran out of stones, and the oil age won't end when we run out of oil. They always knew that they had to diversify eventually to get past oil, but this generation knows that they will be alive and trying to run the country in the time when that homework will be graded. This will come due on their watch. So it's something very different. Then you had the Arab revolutions of 2011, when a lot of societies, including some in the Gulf, went through a period of upheaval. And the leaders of this region, I think, took the lesson, not that they needed to sort of hold down society, although there is certainly a strong authoritarian element, which we can talk about, but they took the lesson that they needed to have what was kind of a revolution from above to basically remake their societies, remake their economies for the young people that live in them, to re-anchor their idea of legitimacy, to rule away from a sort of religious and familial idea into something more nationalist and more dynamic, to give young people more opportunities, to open up society for women, to bring entertainment and culture in a way that didn't exist before. So there was this whole different vision that was taking shape. And when you think about some of the insecurity and instability that an older religious model of exporting, a sort of austere idea of religion created difficulties in the world, this is actually, I think, in some ways, a fantastic opportunity for the United States. And it really is as bold as a reimagining of kind of what a nation is in some ways. Dara'iyah, which is the 300-year-old first capital of the first Saudi kingdom outside Riyadh, is a place that had been an old museum, kind of rundown museum that was restored by the new leaders of Saudi Arabia. And they built a historic museum with 7 Michelin-starred restaurants next to it, consistent with this sort of new Saudi where people come out in public and hang out, men and women together. But they also made one very important change that gets to this idea of kind of what a nation is and an imagined community is. Originally, the story was told that the Wahhabi clerics, who were the very strict religious leaders, and the family of Al Saud had come together to build the modern state. In this retelling, it was the family who did it, and the clerics were kind of airbrushed out of the picture, which was quite an interesting change in terms of a self-conception of how a country imagines what it is and tells its people what they are and who they are in the world. So this is the region of 2030 that's being built. It's focused on young people. It's focused, women are allowed and welcomed into the public space to be astronauts and athletes. It's far from perfect in any way, but it is a fundamental transformation that is palpably felt by the people on the ground, whether it's being able to travel or welcome entertainment or raves, like the one that's called Middle Beast that was held in Saudi Arabia for many years, or hotels being built in places where they never existed, and being built with beer taps for the moment when at some point in the future alcohol maybe will become legal in the kingdom. So what does our relationship as the United States look like with this future-looking Gulf? I think there are a lot of elements alongside the ones we're going to talk about. This is a region that has just about half of the sovereign wealth in the world that can be deployed. Sovereign wealth means government money that can be strategically deployed. A lot of the rest is in China. So when you look at the strategic picture of America and the world, the Gulf countries, which are sort of aspiring to be a kind of middle power, they have an ability to buy ports and compete with China for ports, for strategic, for critical minerals that China or others maybe would want to monopolize, and neither America nor the Gulf would want to see monopolized. They're also making huge investments in the United States. They're doing that mostly because they're good investments, also because they've gotten strong encouragement from the President of the United States to do that. But that's something that they've become an set of investment powers in a way that is extremely important in the world where it's hard to find money to spend on big priorities. They also have become global brokers and conveners. To a really surprising extent, they were the conduit between America and Venezuela. Oman was the conduit between America and Iran. Qatar was the conduit between America and Israel and Hamas. I actually had a week when I was in government where I was there to do business working on the Gulf, and my colleagues who did business on Latin America and Afghanistan we were all at the same hotel in Doha. And it was because they had this role as a kind of broker. That's happening in a lot of different directions. Also, because of the military bases which are being hit this week, we're part of America's operating system in the world, which is something that I saw very acutely in 2021 when Kabul fell, the capital of Afghanistan, fell to the Taliban, and Afghans and American diplomats also, and many others, came by the tens of thousands. And the question was, how do they get to America? We can't safely welcome all these people to America. Where can they go to be processed, to be checked, to be vetted before they can come to America? And it ended up that over 100,000 Afghans, many of whom had fought and risked their lives to serve alongside American soldiers and diplomats and others, translators, countless other people, they spent much of the next year in the Gulf and now have ended up as Afghan Americans in our communities here. So that kind of global operating system and global brokering and global capital is part of this idea, this 2030 concept that I think we want to be building. And the last thing I would mention on that, and I will soon get to Iran, is this sort of tech and AI ambitions. These are people who are digital natives, leaders who are digital natives, who are as comfortable in like a multiplayer video game as they are in like a royal palace, matchless kind of court. And they're both kind of a part of their world. They're making a big bet that they can use cheap energy, cheap land, a good kind of regulatory environment, and the money to buy fancy American semiconductor chips to create what may well be the third biggest center of AI computing power after America and China in the entire world, ahead of even Europe and India, if they can. Some of these guys are so genuinely obsessed with AI for many years before most Americans became passionate about this, and so there's a real interest in the future. There's no shortage of challenges, human capital challenges, internal divisions, authoritarian dynamics and succession risks, frankly, a very dangerous neighborhood, as we'll talk about. The sort of recent apotheosis and peak of this idea of a 2030 Gulf was when Donald Trump went to the Gulf in May, before the June war he had that was fought with Iran by Israel and the United States. In that trip and in that, he really showcased the societies that they were building, the economic vision, the business deals, the semiconductors, the chips, the modern economies, manufacturing that was being built in the Gulf. But then that picture begins to collide with reality. Last June, there was an Israeli war with Iran that brought in the United States. In the last hours of that war, a few missiles were fired at American forces in Doha and Qatar, in Al Udeid Air Base. But fast forward to now, to what you all are living and presumably reading about in the newspapers and hearing about. This war that began, I guess now Saturday, in the first hours of this war, the missiles began falling on these same Gulf countries. So the reason that I wanted to explain the Gulf of 1979 and the Gulf of 2030 is that as this war was approaching, the Gulf states thought to themselves, we want no part of this. We're trying to get to 2030. We're not interested in the fights of 1979. We're trying to get to the future here. You last year had fought a war against Iran and boxed them in and weakened them. And so the Gulf states in the run-up to this war, I think, were quite apprehensive about it. And they, despite some reporting, unanimously all all the Gulf states, all the GCC states were not interested in this. And frankly, they were asking themselves the same questions that many Americans are asking themselves about this, because it hasn't been adequately explained what the objectives are. We know the military objectives: degrade the Iranian military capabilities, to make sure the regime can't threaten others, make sure the nuclear program is weaker, attack the leadership, make it harder for Iran to project insecurity beyond its borders. Those were made clear, but the strategic objectives were much vaguer. Was this about regime change? Was it about getting a better deal from the Iranian government, or was it just about weakening the Iranian government and then walking away? Those questions that many Americans have, because they have not been fully explained by the leadership of the United States, were very prevalent in the Gulf, but from a different perspective, because they knew how dangerous Iran could be, and they also knew that they don't have the luxury of distance. There's some of the small Gulf principalities, you can see Iran across the water. That's how close we're talking about. So they didn't have that luxury of distance, and they didn't have the luxury of pulling back when this is done and being sort of far away. They're right there, and whatever. So what they call the end state, when you do war planning and strategy, you have your objectives, but then you have the end state, which is, how does this thing all end? Where is Iran when this all ends? The end state for them is incredibly important. So what happened is, surprising some people, surprising to me that they were surprised, to be honest, this war began with Iran trying to really regionalize the conflict. They had sort of three main avenues of indirect pressure on the United States to try to get the U.S. and Israel, who are jointly bombing and fighting in Iran, to stop. And their goal at the end of this, I think, is to declare victory and to say the Iranian regime has survived an onslaught from Israel and America, and we've therefore are strong and will continue, and that will be their version of victory. And they want to make that happen faster rather than later because of the amount of degradation of Iran's military leadership, structures, et cetera, that are happening in the meantime. The first was diplomatic. The first vector of pressure that they were trying to use to hasten the end of this war. That ran through the Gulf. They bombed the 6 states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The 7th, Yemen, is run by the Houthis and is kind of its own separate thing. So they bombed Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, all of them. Oman, where the leader had been literally on American TV, all but begging the Trump administration to follow a path of diplomacy, was bombed once, and we thought maybe it was a mistake, and then they were bombed twice at a different port. Kuwait was bombed despite having no role in this. The United Arab Emirates had 1,000 drones and missiles, including 200 ballistic missiles, which are quite serious things that can cause a lot of bloodshed. Thankfully, the Gulf militaries, in part because they've been training with us for a long time, but in part because they've matured and they're doing their own work here, have done a pretty amazing job of withstanding these attacks, taking down the big dangerous missiles, shooting down the drones. The problem is that these missiles and drones cost 1/100th as much to make as the interceptors that take them down, which are like $1 million each sometimes, depending on the nature of the interceptor. And the interceptors are very scarce. And this is enormously frustrating because we've known this for years and years and have failed as a defense industrial base to actually build enough of these interceptors. So we build like 100 of them a year sometimes. And the Iranians are just pumping out thousands of these missiles and drones. So there's a fundamental asymmetry there. And that's the second vector of Iranian pressure to try to end this war, which is that they're trying to exhaust the supplies of defensive interceptors that exist in the Gulf, in Israel, and in the United States to convince these countries to basically pressure America to end the war. And that also runs right through the Gulf, just like the first one. The third one is economic. And guess what? Also right through the Gulf. So what the economic pressure that they're imposing is by threatening the waterway called the Strait of Hormuz, that is a kind of bottleneck in the Persian Gulf, where the energy exports from the Gulf go to meet the world economy. The gas exports from Qatar get liquefied and pumped out through there. The oil exports from Saudi, Kuwait, and others, millions of barrels a day go out. That is creating tremendous pain, economic pain for the Gulf, because this is their model. This is that 2030 dream. The 2030 dream is everybody comes here, global capital chooses us. They invest here, and they say capital is a coward. You know, I mean, it goes to where it's safe, so it won't stay. So their model, they're hurting because they're not making money this week or last week on any oil because it's not pumping out, but they're also hurting because their model, their ability to attract investment, talent from around the world to build these world-class AI companies and all of these other diversification efforts beyond oil that they want are all in danger. That's all well and good, but it's not going to cause America to stop the war or to press Israel to stop the war. What the Iranians are hoping will happen is that the price of gas, where Qatar is like alongside America as the absolute natural gas superpower of the world, they're hoping that the price of gas will go up enough that will change Americans' energy prices. It's already happened in Europe, and it will happen here eventually. And they're hoping that the price of oil, which is not coming out of the Gulf, will eventually go up. Oil is historically low priced and soft at the moment, and so the idea that you're going to get to a high enough price that it's going to cause a lot of political pain for Americans to end this war, we'll have to see. But that is in part the Iranian theory. So basically what I've told you is that the three main ways that Iran is trying to pressure the United States to end this war all run right through the Gulf, which means that outside of Iran, this really is, I think, one of the absolute centers of gravity of this war. And so what's happened, I think, is basically the Gulf states were attacked. Their initial response, I think, was to be quite shocked by the extent of the attack. I mean, frankly, like you see cities that are normally calm, and you see them with pillars of smoke rising where drones and missiles started fires. And the fires weren't just American bases or embassies. They were like a mall in Dubai, an airport in Kuwait, an apartment building in Bahrain. So the social and kind of psychological effect of this is pretty strong. And it had the kind of inverse diplomatic effect of what Iran wanted. It united these countries. They realized that mediating with Iran, pleading with other countries not to attack Iran, got them no favors from Iran. So as much as they didn't want this war and they were mad at the United States and worried about Israel's power, they also saw that the United States, when push came to shove, was their partner in defending themselves. And Iran was the country that brought this war that they weren't part of to the soil of the Gulf. So in terms of what happens next for the Gulf with this war, a lot of it depends what happens with the war itself. I mean, and I have thoughts about that, and I'm happy to get into it. They're weighing a few things. They want to see Iran weakened. Now that Iran has attacked them, they want to see this effort to weaken Iran's conventional military capability persist and succeed. But they also are feeling a degree of economic pain that may at some point lead them to push President Trump to pull back and to end this war sooner or later. They're weighing some pretty bad options for their own choices. They're kind of what they call a policy taker rather than a policy maker on this, because other people are deciding and they're kind of having to abide by what's happening. They could retaliate, and they've thought about it, and they've bought a lot of defense gear from the United States. They could potentially strike Iran, but they're quite worried that if they do that, and if the United States loses interest or just says we've won and declares victory and walks away, that Iran will then retaliate against them for a long time to come. They could mediate with Iran, as they've done many times in the past, to try to end this war faster and get an offer, and I think they probably will. They may strike, and they may retaliate, I doubt it. They probably will mediate, but what we've learned is that there's no great reward for mediation. During the Israel-Hamas war, Doha, which was the mediator, was struck by Israel and Iran, and then during this subsequent ramp-up, Oman, which was the mediator, was struck by Iran. So no great rewards here for mediation, but they probably will do it because they know that their future depends on their ability to get back and put their eyes on the prize of 2030. The other thing that they're doing that's really important to know is they're at the heart of the evacuation effort of the United States. Usually when there's a war, especially when you initiate a war, as the United States did in this case alongside Israel, you make plans for how you're going to take care of the safety of the Americans who are sort of within the radius of danger around this war. But it sure seems like there were not adequate plans in place to evacuate the Americans. And there are 70,000 American citizens in Saudi Arabia, 60,000 in UAE, and on down the line from there. So now they're engaged in a sort of breakneck effort alongside our government, which should have been responsible for this, quite belatedly, to evacuate Americans and to get those Americans to safety if they want to leave or just to make sure that they can shelter in place. So going forward, we really have no choice at this point, as they don't, but to deal with these two Middle Easts at once. The post-1979, post-2003 Middle East of war, which we are dealing with day by day with defense partnerships, and this Middle East that we want to build with the Gulf of 2030, that's focused on AI, youth empowerment, interconnection to the world, integration with other countries, with India, with Israel, with a million other countries in this region, to build something much more global and cosmopolitan, and that is sort of rooted in an idea of connection to the world that's fundamentally different from the ideas of sort of religious extremism or anything that the Gulf countries have recognized was such a threat to them as well. So I think that's where we are. That's what we have to do. The defense, there's nothing that the United States could do with the Gulf that would be more important than finding a responsible way to resolve the situation in Iran. There are only so many paths forward from here. The Gulf, again, as I said, doesn't have the luxury of distance. From their perspective, they would love to see a democratic Iran emerge. It would be weird for them to see a government overthrown to become a democracy. They're not democracies. They don't like that particularly. But if there was a kind of modern-facing Iran that's trying to do something like what they're doing, that would be potentially a partner for them. They have no particular problem with Persian people. It's with the regime of Iran. But they don't see that happening because the guns inside Iran are overwhelmingly held by people aligned with the government. So they see that change in Iran, if you're going to really see the regime overthrown, would have to either be a defection from within the ruling groups and their security forces, or probably a civil war, which is quite scary if you're countries with 35 million people and you're next to a country with 95 million people that has the possibility of kind of sending waves of refugees, losing control of its territory, losing control of its different armed forces and militias. That for them is the kind of chaos that pushes them squarely back into that Middle East of 1979 and puts that Middle East of 2030 totally out of reach. So they're looking at this. They would love to see that transition. There it would be okay, frankly, seeing Iran, the Iran as it is, which for a long time they were very eager to see us strike. They would be okay probably seeing that country weakened as long as it was sort of effectively contained, as if they felt it was before this war, and willing to sort of act within its borders and not project threats out into the region as much. For them, that chaos is really the nightmare scenario almost more than anything. They don't like an Iran that is threatening them from their borders, but they also don't like chaos. And that's fundamentally different from the perspective of Israel, and it may end up being different from the perspective of the United States. We'll have to see what US policy is on Iran, again, because it hasn't been really fully explained in terms of where we're going. Even if what we're doing we now understand a little bit better, but where it's going we understand less. So that, I think, is what we're doing. And then the last thing I'll say, and I will then happily leave it open for questions, having talked for longer than I intended to, sorry about that, is the other thing that is part of the old US Gulf dynamic and part of the new one is people-to-people ties. It is incredibly important. I can't tell you how many times I went to meetings in different Gulf countries and someone would say, like, oh, it's great to see you. I'm a Clemson Tiger, or like, I'm a Purdue Boilermaker, you know, or I'm a Washington Husky, or whatever it was, and then proceed to tell me more about college football than I already know, which is quite a little. But you know, so this American soft power of being the place where this region educates its children, sends its parents when they're sick to get well, goes shopping, goes, you know, looks for culture, looks for ideas, looks for companies, looks for investments. This is a huge part of America's advantage, because when you look at this region, I talked about the Cold War, I talked about the post 9/11 period and the threat from Iran. It's really the first time that the defining challenge of American foreign policy, which in this case I would say is a competition with China as geostrategically, does not line us up cleanly alongside the same side as the Gulf. They want to be free to do whatever they can to modernize their economies. We have a sort of different idea probably as the United States government. It changes, but as to what this next period of geopolitics will be when it comes to the biggest issues. So we really need that people-to-people ties strong, and instead I think we've pursued some very restrictive policies that are going to make that very difficult, where we're kind of running an experiment where the leaders talk all the time. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, talks to Donald Trump probably 10 times a month for the last several months. They no longer announce when they talk, which is a thing that we used to do, but they no longer announce that. But they talk all the time. And the experiment that we're running is what happens if the leaders are constantly talking, but the people are not able to have the same kind of interchange that they used to because of restrictions in how hard it's become to enter the United States. So I guess in closing, what I'd like to do is just urge all of you, if you find any of this interesting, if you find these dynamics interesting, find your way to the Gulf. It is an incredibly open, interesting, friendly, dynamic set of countries where a young American can learn, or anyone can learn an incredible amount about the future of the world, the future of geopolitics, key industries. And frankly, they need to hear more from us because there are fewer of them coming than there ever were. There were 100,000 Saudis a year who came about 20 years ago to the United States. I wrote an article about this recently. I think we're going to get below 10,000 this year in terms of Saudis coming to America. Now, that's for a lot of reasons, not only because of Donald Trump. Some of it was COVID. Some of it was their own universities are getting better. It's changing. But my last pitch to you would be to just consider, as you think about where to go and what to do, this region is incredibly important. It's not an accident that they're at the center of this war, because increasingly they're at the center of a lot of what happens in geopolitics, far beyond even the Middle East, including in AI and elsewhere. So as you all get a chance to travel and think about where to go, I urge you to consider thinking about and working on this region. So I'll stop there.